person. Thank you. Sit. Hey, Parisa.
Hey, David.
Where are we?
We are back.
What are you doing?
This studio is wildly kind of emotional for us, I think, because it was where we had so many arguments when we were doing Mediation, but also broke through many songs and got them to the point that we needed on the album. So I feel like we've kind of come full circle to be back here.
The last time I was here, I came for some writing sessions, and I also came to go through Mediation with you, which I guess we'll get into today.
Wild time.
Wild time. We should also give some time at the beginning of this maybe to say, like, we're friends.
We're friends
we
now.
get along. It's great. We've always been friends, even when we weren't friends.
Yeah.
But, like, when we weren't friends, we really weren't friends, actually.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this is like a interesting full circle moment. So we met in 2010 in Haifa, Israel. Both of us were taking a gap year after high school to go volunteer at the Baha'i World Center. So we were both 18-year-olds. I had brought a guitar, and Parisa was an amazing singer, as I found out. So it was really natural that we were like, oh, we should make music together. And that just kind of turned into like a year of like, you know, every couple of weeks we would sit down and hang out, and inevitably there would be music made, and it was really fulfilling. And at the end of that year, I started producing electronic music, and just because I really valued Parisa's input and taste, I just started sending her beats and basically saying to her, like, if you feel like singing on any of these, like, please, like, that would be amazing. And, you know, year and a half goes by, and it's 2013, and I'm interning at this recording studio, like, way in the woods of, like, Western Washington. And the guy who runs the studio gives me the keys and is like, I'm going to be gone all summer, so the studio's yours. So first person I called was Parisa, and I was like, hey, I have a crazy idea. Why don't you come to Seattle for a month and we can just like make music? I was very blunt about what I thought about things. And actually it's funny because I do think that being direct is a strength of yours as we've like gotten to know each other. But like in 2013, we were just like, you know, I felt like there was so much pressure with how little time we had. Like we had a month. I was like, there's gonna be so much time. And then all of a sudden it's a week before you leave. And I remember like 48 hours before you left, we didn't have any lyrics. Like we had like pages of lyrics we had yet to write. So that writing trip, it was really fruitful. It was really like, we definitely bonded, but it was for sure trauma bonding. It was like, we were in the trenches together, and like, you know, we come out of that writing period, kept producing it up, and then put out the EP in 2015, pretty much blew up overnight.
I was in university studying law, and you were also in university. I remember we weren't even sure if we wanted to do this as a career. Thankfully, Melody, our manager, put in a good word with both of us and convinced us. And then, you end up moving to Sydney. I also moved from Canberra to Sydney so that we could basically build out this band, build out this career from scratch. And I remember that time as just a frenzy of like, we had to basically build a whole show that was 40 minutes long. We had 18 minutes of music.
And we had 3 weeks to do it.
3 weeks, and we were stressed because we had to perform for the first time. And I do think our friendship was starting to, like, already at that point be tested, which added extra anxiety. So, it was a really complex.
We had 9 shows in the first month. Well, actually, I think we had 3 weeks to prep for the first one. Then our first 2 shows were opening for Monsters and Men at, like, 2,500 to 3,500 cap rooms. Third show was a festival for 10,000 people, and then it was a headline run, and like 0 performance experience. I mean, like high school bands, I think, for both of us, but beyond that, like 0 performance experience. And I think that was the time that a lot of the feelings from 2013 started to come up again. Just having to have our manager like resolve conflicts. The moment that stands out to me the most, and I'm curious, I would assume that's the same for you, but I'm curious, is we did a European tour. It was our last headline tour. And from beginning to, like, literally day one until, I think it was at least 12 shows, something like 12, 13 shows. From day one until day 21 or whatever, it was just either arguments or not talking.
Yeah. What was going on? I
think we were physically and mentally exhausted. We had, like, something like 80 shows in 7 months or something, like pretty pretty big amount of shows.
Yeah.
And that was the point where we would be arguing, frustrated in the morning, not talk to each other all day while we're in a small tour van, like we're sitting next to each other, not talking. Then sound check without really talking to each other, or arguing over whether to use the projector or the screen. and then playing the show and
with
acting
smiles.
like we were friends. Like we had to get on stage and act like we were all chummy. And it was so confusing.
I remember feeling constantly anxious from when you moved until 2019, so probably 4 years. I think I was just so anxious every time we had to make a decision. I was so scared that my opinion would get kind of like crushed, and I knew your opinion was going to get crushed, and we didn't have a framework, we didn't have a way to like try and do what we were doing. And I just was constantly freaking out that how are we going to make these big decisions? We had to decide what show we wanted to put on. We had to decide like what songs we wanted to write. We had to decide what artwork we wanted, what accommodation we wanted to stay in, how we wanted to interact on camera. It was like heaps of micro decisions, and I was terrified of every single one.
Being in a band, doing any kind of creative pursuit is really intense. For you guys, what were the intensities of the relationship that were coming to the forefront whilst you're trying to create your art?
Where do we even start?
I think where we were at is that our friendship was damaged. I think creative tension is so normal and so required as part of the process, but I think what happened was that started to affect our perception of each other and our respect for each other. And I think that meant that as our friendship was based on less respect, less trust for each other, it kind of became like all business, all creative, and that was all tense. And so then our friendship had very little room to breathe and was getting damaged every time we'd get into the studio. We weren't really making much time to be friends outside of it. The funny thing is the points of tension that we were experiencing were also a reflection of our strengths in a weird way. So for example, like I think you are kind of the band's creative visionary, and then at the same time I'm potentially the executor, type A, kind of like have creativity that's maybe more in a framework in my mind. So I think the tension would come from these two seemingly opposite dynamics of like the big kind of sweeping ideas and things like that coming into just this wanting to execute that I would bring. And that was a huge point of tension because we would, for example, sit down to write a song and you would come in with wanting to push it as far as we could go creatively and explore it, and I would resist that because I wanted to get it done and I wanted the creativity to be organized. There's a lot more in that, but that was just like, I think that tension of our personalities was a really big thing, I would say. So we decided to write an album, and we started the process of writing. I think we did a couple of trips to visit each other, and I think this is 2018, the same kind of issues kept coming up, the same frustrations. I think it would be kind of interesting to go back into like some of the issues that we were facing at the time, because I feel like we've like completely shifted things so much that I almost don't remember.
Yeah, I remember.
But
I deeply remember.
Yeah, I think it's a good exercise. Like,
give us one example.
Example.
Just one.
You go for it.
So we're doing these writing trips. So part of the context here is we're doing these like 3-week writing trips. Paris has come into New York a couple times. I went to Sydney, I think, once before I ended up coming back for the mediation. And on one of these writing trips, Paris is in New York, and we're realizing, like some of the writing and production in this album, this is like mid-2019, like it needs help. Like we need to start bringing in some collaborators. We need to like open up the Vallis family a little bit and get some help from a couple experts who can just like listen to our music, give us feedback. So we decided, like David, why don't we have you meet with producers on your end, and Paris can meet with songwriters on her end. We were like, yeah, we'll see how it goes, and then we'll touch base over Zoom, and we'll see what makes sense to do. And the fatal error, I mean, one of 1,000 fatal errors that we made, is like I would take meticulous notes on what these producers would say. And a lot of the feedback that I was getting was starting to go outside of production. It was going into songwriting. And the way I translated that to you came across as like, oh, we need to change everything. We need to throw out everything 2.5 years into making this album.
The example that you're sharing of you taking some very objective information and sharing it with me as someone who's songwriting in any other world is actually very fine and like nothing wrong. But I think it speaks to the fact that there were underlying feelings, right? Like you sharing that information with me made me think, oh, David hasn't been listening to me for 3 years. Like, I've been writing these lyrics. Why isn't he listening to me? And it made you think, why isn't she listening to me? I've been saying that these songs need to improve for so long. And this is what needs to improve them. And like, I've been trying to push that part. And I'd be like, David is taking too long on this side. Why isn't he listening? Like, so I think that one simple email actually covered the territory of all the underlying things. And then it was like, no friendship existed.
You know, it's so rare that a band breaks up because their music sucks. Like, that never happens. Like, the quality of the music is less of an important factor as the relationship between the bandmates. The spirit of it is what's more important. Like, the music does not even matter. I mean, this is what the first half of our album was. It's like we were making really great stuff, but neither of us could appreciate it. You know what I mean? Like, there was a period of time where it was like being in our band, being a bandmate was really hard. When you're not talking to somebody that you're eating pizza with in Hamburg 7 p.m. before going into a show.
I just remembered that moment.
Yeah, it's like that, you know, poor God bless
I remember
our long
hugging
suffering.
you and crying in that pizza shop in Hamburg.
Did you hug me? I remember you crying.
Yes, because we were like, we were both apologizing to each other because we knew everything was so terrible.
Yeah.
But like, I think we knew at the root of it there was this friendship and that we had that respect and love for each other as friends. As like, we're like brother and sister, but
Definitely.
it had like gotten so lost, and it was like this moment in time where we were like, I see you, but this is really crap.
And that was when we scheduled Fight Night. Do you remember Fight Night? Where it was like, Parisa, I forgot the term you used. It was something similar to that, but we're having this moment in Hamburg, and this was after a fucking grueling, like, just really difficult tour where we just decided there's a lot we need to talk about, but this is not the time. Like, we need to be at a point where we've gotten a couple days of like full night's rest before we like dig into any of this. We finished that tour. It was our last headline tour, and we had one show left before I was moving to New York. And Paris was like, okay, we're gonna give it a couple days, but then I want you to come to my backyard. We're gonna have tea, and we're gonna fight. Like, I mean, we were like laughing as we were saying that, but it was very much like, okay, we're gonna try to work through all this. I remember like you served this tea, and like we sort of sat in your backyard and like laughed for a few minutes. Like, okay, well,
you
want to go first?
douchebag.
You suck. Like, yeah.
I think then the difference between that and mediation was we didn't have someone guiding us forward. Like, we were just sitting in it, and then we eventually got to a point where we're like, we need some help. We need some tools. The way that you would approach how much time we needed to put into a song. I feel like I would just, like, we would be writing a song, and then I'd be like, cool, I feel like we have some really good stuff, and then you would be like, nope. We need to keep going and we need to keep pushing it. We need to get to this idea, you know? And that would really frustrate me because I was so confused. I didn't understand where that was coming from. Now I'm like, hell yes. Let's spend that time because I understand where your brain is and I know what you're trying to do. And I think for a long time there was a million little instances where you would suggest something or you would do something and I just didn't understand where your brain was at. So we were two people trying to make something, not knowing how to go about it in the best way. Basically, it got to a point where my mental health was so impacted. Like, I literally, and I know yours was too, but I kind of started to question why I was in the band. Like, what was the purpose of being in this band and building this life if I was so unhappy every day and so frustrated constantly that I wasn't being heard, and I knew you felt like you weren't being heard either. And it was just the two of us. Like, we had to make it work. If we weren't working, then what was the point? And I remember sitting down with you, I think it was on Zoom or on a phone call, and I kind of was like, I don't think I can do this anymore. I'm done. unless something dramatic changes.
So after that conversation where you said, like you wanted some time off to figure out what made sense, Melody tells us to book a flight to Sydney basically immediately. And I think our first day of mediation was like 5 or 6 days into studio sessions. And you came, I'm curious, like, what do you remember from that very first, like, you walk into the flat I was staying in, Tim's there.
Yeah, so I walk in, Tim's there. Tim is this beautiful, kind person who's come to us with basically a framework to help us work through our issues. And we didn't know what to expect, so we went in and I just felt so terrified and so hopeful at once. It was like, this better be the shining beam of light forward for our band, because without it I was like, I don't know, what am I going to do? David can't do this either, like what's the point? And so that was the feeling I took in, absolute fear and absolute hope at once. The approach that Tim wanted to take with us was really helpful. He came in not necessarily diving into our issues, but rather calling us to a series of principles that were needed in a healthy, creative environment where people could be free to think and free to create. And he would name those principles, explain them, and then we would delve into how those principles applied to our dynamic. And through that, we were able to explore some of the issues. So it was very different to, for example, what I've heard about marriage counseling, where you might go in and you might tackle your problems to start. It was that we were going in with these high ideals we were trying to work towards. Tim brought these ideals to us, and it was through that lens that we had to analyze our problems. And I remember just everything came out. All the issues we were facing. Like, I feel like I'm not being heard. I feel like I'm not empowered to write, which is why I keep saying, let's just finish it. Because I feel like my ideas are getting trumped constantly. And you would share the exact same thing. I feel like my ideas are getting trumped constantly, so I feel like I need to push things forward, or I feel like I can't even raise my ideas because I feel like they're constantly pushed aside. And we were like, oh my god, that's so
finally
crazy.
Something in common.
So David, I remember the sessions, and this actually isn't unusual in that Parissa was kind of welcoming the mediation, and you were a lot more guarded, which a lot of blokes are. How did it feel to you walking into that kind of a situation where you've actually got to address these communication issues?
I was absolutely dreading it. I was like not looking forward to it at all. This is gonna sound stupid, but I genuinely mean it. You're just smarter than me. And so like when when we have like arguments and conversations and discussions, I don't have a way of sort of, I'm not like a tit for tat kind of guy. I feel like you're also I feel like this might be your legal training and your confidence and just like your ability to articulate yourself. I feel like all of that I lose it under pressure. When I'm under pressure, I have no ability to articulate myself. And I have no memory. I was really anxious that like I wasn't going to be able to use my voice. And also because I wasn't going to be able to use it, that I wasn't going to be receptive to listening to what you had to say. So there was like a lot of resentment and sort of self-doubt that I brought coming into it. That, of course, your openness and vulnerability brought a lot of comfort to me as well. And I think it like mutually, I think we could kind of reassure each other through the process. We didn't even get into the nuts and bolts of what was wrong until the third day. The first 2 days were just sort of setting our compasses and like aligning them a little bit. And it was mostly Tim talking. We barely said anything. I was expecting to come in and just rehash these is every single experience. And on day 1, Tim said, forget about the past. It's useless. We're not even going to talk about that until the third day, if we even get to it. Thank God we didn't get into specifics until the third day, because by the time we were ready to have that, Tim said, you have like, you remember how long? It was like 10 minutes uninterrupted to speak. Literally no interruptions, no clarifications, and the other person just has to listen. And then when you're done, you remember what we had to say to the other person?
Repeat that? No.
No. It was, what else?
Oh, yes.
And then they would talk for another 10 minutes, and then what else? And then we just kept doing that until everything was out. I remember the third what else I did with you was when you started crying and then started saying all this stuff like, I just don't even know, like, I don't know what I'm doing here anymore. Like, I don't know where it's at. And as soon as that came out, then I really felt like we had a breakthrough, because I had my own version of that too when you had your second or third what else.
what happened in mediation was we were forced to listen to each other and where our heads were at. The way you speak can either be targeted to the person that you want to hear it. So, or it can be just completely like to the left of their ear. And I think after understanding each other in mediation, I would then speak in a way which I knew, oh, David's going to hear this a lot better because I know him, I know what his intentions are, so I'm going to say it in this way because he'll hear me better. And so as much as we felt like we weren't being heard, it was also that we weren't speaking correctly and we weren't addressing each other correctly based on our personalities, I think. And I think that was one big shift we had. Suddenly, for example, I was like, oh, David and I have the same goals when it comes to a song. And it's not that he's trying to get me to push myself to write in a certain way, but it's actually that he has this overall vision for us creatively, where if we work on it a little bit harder, we might get to a new level. And it's nothing to do with me and my ability. So let's create space for it. One of the biggest things I took away from mediation was that I was not confident enough in my own ideas to bring that confidence with me into the studio. So then it started affecting like our ability to write songs because I wouldn't fight for things. I would just kind of like go half in. So yeah.
For me now with this tool of like, you know, just vocalize, hey, Parisa, I'm just like reaffirming that I want your voice in this. So do you feel comfortable with this? So then she would be like, well, you know, actually this idea felt best when we did this. And then just choosing to like fully yes and that, in the sense that like you're supporting and trying to collaboratively build someone else's vision, even if you don't get it. Like that's the best way of getting to two great options. Either the idea that you don't understand works, or the idea that you don't understand is proven to not work to the other person, and then you're on the same page. Every single time I made an active decision to do that, it helped us. There was a song that would not be on the album if both of us didn't do that.
Yeah.
And funny enough, that was before mediation. Let go, trust your collaborator, and just trust the process enough to know that you'll either get something great or you'll get clarity on something.
Every idea is an ugly duckling. And so if you would bring me an idea, I didn't want to kill the little duckling. I needed to let it grow and ask you questions to help you get to the end of your idea. And I feel like what had happened in the past is you would bring an idea or a glimpse of an idea and I'd be like, that's ugly, let's kill it. I don't want that idea anymore. What is this? And so I would shut it down, and so you weren't listened to. And I think one massive change was that afterwards, every time you brought an idea, I would ask you questions about it, and we would get to the end of it. And I loved actually hearing about it because we actually tapped into a high level of creativity that we weren't able to before mediation, because we allowed ourselves to be vulnerable and listen to each other and share in a way that we hadn't before.
The most powerful tip, I think, of all of mediation is when somebody shows you an idea and asks you what you think of it, you actually turn back to them and say, well, what do you think about it? When Parisa would send me a vocal idea, I would instead say, and she would be like, well, what do you think about this? I would instead say, well, you walk me through what your feelings are on it. And then suddenly, all of these points where I would normally start criticizing, she was actually addressing before me. And not only was she addressing them, she was like, of her own volition saying, it's not really there yet. It's not really there yet, but I don't fully get what it needs. Or she would say, this is the best part. And if everything else around it needs to change it. But this is the best part. And then all of a sudden, there were these guardrails where there weren't before. And there was, like, I already knew before I even shared my thoughts, points of consensus. And where there's points of consensus, it's actually, like, so much more energizing to then be able to give feedback, because you know somebody else is going to be listening to you. Because suddenly they can trust you've seen the best of their idea, and I can trust that you're really ready for me to share, you know?
Yeah.
I can't even tell you how emotionally attached I am to my bad ideas when I send you... No, I think it's different. I think I'm the one who's really...
No.
You know,
Definitely not.
just by Parisa asking me what I think about it, it makes me feel safe to share the things I'm not confident about it as well. And then suddenly she gets where I'm trying to get with it, and then she'll say one thing that completely reshifts it. Otherwise, if she can't feel the excitement that I feel, I'll really feel like, oh, this is just like, you know, she didn't even give this a second thought, you know? Powerful, powerful technique.
This in-between phase, we'd had basically all these tools given to us about how to communicate. I remember one big thing was not to write any creative feedback or have any creative discussions, not to write anything, to always call each other, not have it on Slack. We used to use Slack all the time. Such a simple piece of advice, such a simple tool to call someone, but it completely changed our dynamic, because then I was able to hear in your feedback when you gave it verbally on the phone, I was able to hear the emotion behind what you were saying, and that it wasn't menacing, for example, or that it wasn't targeted at me, it was targeted at this overall vision. And you were able to hear my emotion behind things too. And there was things like a tool that we had 3 minutes each to speak about a creative idea in team meetings. And so one person would go 3 minutes, and then the next person and the next person. So you could actually hear what the other person was thinking before you started to decide a creative decision. And I remember we also started doing friendship calls where we would call each other outside of business things that we had to talk about, and we would just talk and catch up. And it was so nice to have that again, that dynamic that maybe 10 years ago, 12 years ago we'd had, and then we'd slowly lost along the way. And so I think these micro decisions that we made in our process started to shift the direction of our friendship, started to shift the direction of our collaboration. And I think we're using a lot of them today too. Even thinking to last week, we had to make a decision about our new show, and we were sitting down with our manager and each had 3 minutes to talk, and it was so great. Like, yeah, so it's something that I'm trying to do in many of my friendships in life, is just make that time for the other person. And it's something that I learned from our process.
You and I, our song You and I, not you
Not
and
you.
I, but our song You and I is actually quite literally what we were going through.
Well, I remember we had this song kind of floating around. It had a piano, an idea of a melody, and then we threw that away because it wasn't really hitting both of our hearts, which was something we thankfully agreed on. And then I remember I was sitting with it because I loved the instrumental that you had been building so much, and I wanted to write a melody to it. And this was when you were in Sydney. And I remember I had a really confronting conversation with someone while you were here during the week we were working on it, where basically they had essentially said they didn't believe that inequality existed between men and women. And I was so shocked that someone our age could think that way, and it was a really tense conversation. And so I sat down and was writing a melody and lyrics, and the first lines of the song came about, which were, I feel like you live in a different universe, it's just a silhouette of burst. Like that kind of idea that I was singing a song to someone who thought so differently to me that it was shocking, that it was just so confronting. And I remember showing it to you, and you then built a chorus idea for it. And you actually wrote to me and said, I think this is actually a chorus about our friendship, because this song and the verses remind me so much of our friendship.
Well, I thought you had written it about me, but it turns out I learned later you'd written about this other guy.
That's how bad things were between us. That I was, which was hilarious to me. And at first I was so frustrated because I was like, why is he writing a chorus about something completely different? But thank goodness you took it down the path of our friendship, because then what happened to the song? I feel like this is really...
Well, the first version of that song was actually called Forgive and Rewrite. You remember that?
Yeah.
Where it was a piano loop, very much like a piano-heavy song. The final song ended up being more guitar-heavy. But the original chorus lyrics, if I remember, were... it's a very similar theme. It was like, when the fighting's over, no one cares who's right. Losing my composure, guess that proves you right. I used right twice there. That's not great. But so why don't you come on over, share the weight on your shoulders tonight, and let's just try to forgive and rewrite. So it was like the theme was very much present. But then once we had those verses, it was like the chorus just didn't really feel right anymore, because his verses were now this like really sort of ephemeral, like much more artistic interpretation of like this sort of chorus. So we're okay, we're going to rewrite the chorus. And I ended up sitting down with a friend of mine, Eric, who plays in Young the Giant. I just showed him like this guitar loop, and I showed him the verses you made, and I showed him this chorus, and I was like, I don't really get... It was like, on behalf of both of us, like we don't kind of really understand this chorus. He sort of like mumbled this idea. It was like, wanted. And as soon as I heard the word wanted, I was like, oh, that's really interesting. As soon as all those pieces came together, the chorus just completely spilled out. Yeah, this idea of distance between two people who are close felt like one of those contradictions that was interesting to write to, because I feel like the best lyrics we get are when we can find little moments of contradictions lyrically and just like laying it out in a very frank way. We don't have very many frank choruses, so that felt really good.
It feels like that song, You and I, is essentially encapsulating a moment in time of where we were at when things were really hard, and almost has the truths of the things we had to understand in order to move forward, which was that there was a distance between us, which was that we actually only wanted the same thing. And I think from that point, and pretty much like when that song came to be and you sat down with Eric and wrote it out and fleshed it out, I think that's when our friendship really took a turn for the better, and we had started rebuilding our friendship. And I remember feeling so good. We could sit down and talk again and laugh again and have fun together and feel like we were about to embark on this album as friends, because we'd gone through all these hard truths of our personalities before that point.
There's songs that you stumble your way into, and then there's songs that you earn. And that one we very much had to go through just like grinding halts in our friendship to get to those, really to those emotions and to that level of like vulnerability. And actually it's interesting because that didn't necessarily introduce the theme of our friendship to the album, but it very much tied together a lot of the feelings in our friendship to the album, where we could finally in one of our songs acknowledge how difficult our creative relationship has been at points. It felt really like cathartic to acknowledge that.
This song is basically halfway through the album release, and I feel like we've come so far from 2020 February where we started to kind of repair our friendship, and it's nice to reflect on us now, I think. And I don't know how you feel, but it feels like the best our dynamic has ever been, and it's so nice to release music and so nice to be releasing this song with our dynamics so free and light and happy, and our friendship in such a good place.
Personally, I feel so much more safe in our friendship. Just being able to trust that like you will encourage me to use my voice, and I'll encourage you to use your voice.
Yeah. I think what's really nice is we're not afraid to seek truth about each other's feelings anymore. So now I can easily ask you how you're feeling, and I'm not afraid to know, and I'm not afraid to be there to support you. Whereas maybe in the past I was afraid to ask you because I knew the answer would a lot of the time be about how I was causing you grief. And now that we understand each other and we've worked really hard on our communication, we can be there to support each other through life in general and really understand how each other is feeling. And I think it's nice because a lot of the album is about seeking truth in general, truth about who you really are as a person, the truths of what it's like to migrate to a new country, the truths of being a woman in a world where misogyny is really common and existent everywhere. So I think it's nice that we have found that truth in between us, and a lot of the songs are about the same kind of thing too. So again, it feels like we've come full circle in that way. Yeah. Super deep.
Pretty deep. It's a little too deep. I had a realization early on where, regardless of whether we thought our friendship was part of the story of the album, it simply was part of the story of the album. And it's really been part of the story of our band from the beginning. And giving space to talk about this, well, I hope, is something that other people will be able to watch who are in similar collaborative relationships. I hope they'll be able to like relate to that, because the reality is like the best collaborations are between two people who have different strengths. And if you have different strengths, there's chances are that like it's taking you on divergent paths throughout life, and being able to find somewhere to meet in the middle and being able to acknowledge that things can get hard and pushing through them. You know, like we've pushed past the point where most bands would have broken up twice now. I think once on that European tour and once in 2019, 2020. And here we are, like, yeah, I feel better than ever. Like, it's possible. It's doable.
No, I think that's
What
great.
else?
I think that's good. That was perfect.